If you've been following along, then you're aware that this game right here is one of my favorites. A roguelike dungeon crawler put to an amazing score, but not only that, it's fueled by it. Built into the very fabric of the gameplay is the music. It is the sole driving factor of your actions and choices. It forces you to move, and not just that, but calculate and time your movements with a systematic pattern of urgency that is always pounding into you, beat after beat. The music is a prominent theme and narrative device. It courses through the characters as they descend into the depths and face treacherous foes. It is the literal pulsing of their hearts. The entire conflict revolves around a mystical cursed lute that brings and takes away life with its music. Crypt of the NecroDancer, developed by Brace Yourself Games with a soundtrack composed by Danny Baranowski, and not to mention recomposed by several other fantastic musicians, is clearly a game about adventure, the hero's journey, just like any other, but it's about the score more than anything else. But that argument could be made for so many titles, and I'm sure before my day is up I'll do it countless times on this very channel, so what's the difference here with this one? What does that mean for this indie darling? I alluded to it earlier, but for those that haven't played Crypt of the NecroDancer, your goal is to traverse through as many floors as possible, upgrade your weapons, your armor, get some money, some spells, before being mercifully killed, losing it all, and starting over. Sounds like a roguelike for sure, but that's not all. The main antagonist of the title is the NecroDancer, hence the name of the game, and his dark arts channeled through every part of his caverns, forcing not only the player, but also all the enemies, items, and rooms to operate to the beat of his music. You can only make effective moves in time with the song that is being played throughout each stage. If you want more details as to why the developers chose to go with this specific tactic, check out this unofficial prequel to this video. The link is in the description at the end of this one. On the surface, or on paper, you would imagine that this gimmick would not only hold back the musical power of the composer in order to accommodate those players with less musical awareness, but also put a strong damper on the flow of the game to keep it from getting out of hand and running away from the player's control. It doesn't. In fact, I would go as far to say that it perfects the formula it set out to create. So let's start at the beginning. Measure 1, the first song on the soundtrack, Tombtorial. You get 4 measures and 4/4 of heavily bass-emphasized downbeats, a small bit of subdivision, but it's not very complicated, cementing in your mind what to listen for and adapting your perception into that tempo, at around 100 beats per minute. Fairly slow. Subtly a counter melody comes in, but being in the low register keeps it in the background, and it introduces the upbeat with more distinction, which is brought out further with the introduction of our actual melody. But even that doesn't stay around too long, so even at this point you've lost the pulse. Baranowski strips away the ensemble down to the bass and drums again, with more subtle appearances, but not continuous layering of that upbeat. You've got a good 6 measures to recollect before we kick back in the full set of instruments. It's the best lead-in to the skills you'll need to develop as a listener and a player at the most core concept. Downbeats and upbeats, very little ornamental leading to make you jump the beat except in sparse occasion by the drums. Only a slight swing to confuse your placement of the beat by some of the later included instruments, but it's pretty simple. Now let's get to the first set of rooms. Floor 1-1 is Disco Descent, and now that Baranowski has alluded to that upbeat, he can efficiently attempt to challenge the player with presenting it in more obviously distracting ways. The tempo has only been raised by 15 beats per minute to 115, but the illusion of moving through the measures quicker is due to the introduction of placing prominent notes of the melody on the upbeat, like on the second beat of the first measure or in the melody when the bass returns to its normal downbeat placement. The player has a chance to internalize tempo while being exposed to prominent upbeats. Once we get through this introduction section and we get to the actual theme of the level, we start seeing sweeps up into the first beat of every other measure, attempting to push the player's perception of the beat early. With bridges between each chorus, the player has a chance to recollect themselves as most of the hectic parts are stripped away. In 1-2 Crypteque, he switches up the time signature from 4-4 to 12-8, but he divides the beat into threes, making the greater pulse of the level still feel like it's in 4. What does this do? Well, the idea of conquering the upbeat is stretched into not only feeling the upbeat, but in a triplet fashion, and although this is introduced fairly quickly in the level just after 8 measures, the drum and bass stays consistently accenting the 4 downbeat. And when the melody comes in with each note in the highest register space being placed on the large beats of the measure, while the subdivisions are still present, the player can now get themselves a solid internal tempo while subconsciously feeling that counter triplet division. Although we do transition back to 4-4 in level 1-3, Mausoleum Mash, the tempo is ramped up to a full 140, and Baranowski drives the pulse even faster by subdividing the beat into 4. It actually sounds pretty chaotic at the beginning. Even after the first 8 measures where this is pounded into our ears, he introduces melody and counter melody in the same range, with one pretty consistently divided into the larger beats, while the other on occasion will syncopate onto the ups. Sure, you can regain your footing in the transition from the intro to the first chorus while we revert back to a binary subdivision, but Baranowski doesn't let this last because the bass goes back to a 16th note subdivision while the sole melody is offset from the greater downbeats of the measure by a whole eighth, making the most prominently mixed portion of the ensemble wholly on the upbeat. Forcing the player to the edge of their seat, anticipating their next move with anxiety as the pulse is ever pushed forward and forward. This level of pressure ebbs and flows through the structure of these songs, jumping the beat, making you hit early, feeling like you're being pushed to as opposed to being within the pulse of the dungeon around you. In contrast, we have the second stage of levels, not only apart from the traditional dungeon diving tropes like skeletons, dirt, slimes, just the normal fantasy theming we all know, we see the first stylized zone, mushrooms and armadillos, grass, moss, and mold. The imagery evokes spores being slowed down or unsteady, and the music reflects this as well. Up until this point, I've been referring to the pulse of the song as 4 solid and equal beats, but in reality, for the most part, the larger emphasis that makes the song feel a specific way is actually on 2 beats, 1 and 3, at least in time signatures that have 4 beats. It's different for signatures of 3 or 5 and so on. But starting with 2-1 Fungal Funk, Baranowski changes to the jazz or rock feel by putting the heavy emphasis alternatively on 2 and 4. A more relaxed, some say laid back feel gives the listener the illusion of the tempo being slower than it actually is. Not only that, Fungal Funk is, although debatably, written in 12/8, so some notes attempt to feel more on the beat than they actually are, misconstruing your sense of tempo, and this is the main compositional method of the melody 18 measures in, where most of the notes are actually placed on the upbeat, usually directly after the downbeat. You may notice that it actually does feel slower, but it's only slower than Mausoleum Mash by 10 BPM, at 130. 2-2 Grave Throbbing is actually the same tempo as Mausoleum Mash, while giving off the impression of quite the opposite. The debate of whether or not these zones are in 12/8 or 4/4 is also more present in this level because, like the previous floor, the bass is accenting the greater 4 beats, while the melody and chord structure is tied to a pattern of 3s. A common way to make the player not only lose a sense of pulse, but also blur the lines of where measures actually begin and end. He even mixes up the two of them come 2-3 Portobello Head, where even though the tempo is now a full 150 beats per minute, Faster than any piece before it, the melody fluctuates through being divided in 2 and 3 frequently. Most of the instruments even slide up and down into their next notes, giving off a loose overall feeling. The use of these techniques in these particular ways and the way they play with one another off the usual accent pattern, the player will be pulled back and held away from the beat, forcing them to strike late, letting the player relax, giving them a false security to subconsciously put off decisions, lay back, and fall into the clutches of the various baddies. While these things do come up in the 3rd and 4th level stages, it's not just more of the same. Separate parts of the same songs actually either attach themselves to the push forward mentality, while others will try and make you fall behind, and the player must balance and master both conceptions of the pulse. Even some pieces, primarily in the 4th level stages, start to take the driving drums we've seen stay solid in prior songs away from the downbeat. But because of this strong similarity to the others, I won't go into the deep analysis of each one. I do want to talk a bit about the game's bosses though, because not only does each boss have a really interesting musical theme in their design, their soundtrack accompaniment is pretty unique and provides another layer separate from the normal adventuring challenge. Death metal, or by his song name Metalmancy, divides the beat once again into 8 as opposed to 4. But not just that, the player no longer is instructed to make moves on just the bigger 4 beats. The control heartbeat is actually being placed on the down and up beats, the one and only time so far that the player has to subdivide during their journey, cranking the tempo up to 175 while feeling twice as fast. Deep Blues, or Night to C Sharp, is the most swung song of the whole soundtrack, while all the prominent parts, aside from the drums, being pushed heavily off the traditional beat pattern. Sweeping notes and slides also give a sense of unsteadiness as well. The only irregular beat pattern is found in the King Konga boss fight, or Konga Konga Kappa, which is technically composed in a 4-2 time signature, where the player must track the beats of each measure in order to not jump the pickup into the next phrase. The only time the player must be aware of the phrasing of the music, but also adhere to not having the ability to consistently move with every beat. I personally think the challenge of Coral Reef or Deep Sea Blues is more on the actual mechanics of the boss, just like I feel like most of the challenges in Stage 3 is centered on the enemies. Similarly, the mechanic of controlling 2 characters at once or using the golden lute is much more challenging than the music actually exists to make it during the NecroDancer fights. But these are the only times that the tempo actually changes mid-stage, which is pretty interesting. While the golden lute fight at the very end is extremely tricky, not only for the actual difficulty of the fight, but actually because it does the opposite. The music slows down into halftime, while the player still controls away at the greater pulse. It's not that the game itself has ridiculously confusing mechanics or tricky puzzles, and too tough for their own good enemies like other roguelikes that are wildly unforgiving and just ruthless in order to extend the game time. Crypt of the NecroDancer takes its very core theme of music and turns it from background enhancement to not only the biggest tool at your disposal, but also sometimes your greatest enemy. It is ever present and necessary for your survival, but it's constantly attempting to trick and deceive you subconsciously, trip you up, or mold your perception of the choices you are making. Too fast, too slow, awkwardly timed, or through drastic contrasts, the music leads you on a way, then immediately tries to push you another. It is the true manipulator of your movements and decisions, the urgency you feel, all musically motivated. It just gives you the illusion of feeling in control. And that is true compositional power.
If you didn't know, the Gameside Guys is powered by Patreon, so if you like this or any of our other content, think about taking a look at our page and donating a couple bucks. You could get your name in the credits of every one of our longer videos, get every video a day early, or even some exclusive rewards. If you're feeling generous, think about it, but even watching and sharing is always appreciated.